December 22, 1944. The Ardennes awakens under a brutal metallic silence, broken only by the crack of distant artillery and the groan of trees splitting under ice. Snow swirls sideways, stinging exposed skin like needles, turning forests into white labyrinths where men can vanish 10 steps from safety. In the frozen town of Bastogne, American paratroopers huddle in foxholes and cellars, boots stiff as boards, fingers numb around rifle triggers. German armor tightens the ring. Loudspeakers echo through the cold with a promise that sounds final: surrender now or be destroyed. Every hour without relief feels like a sentence being read aloud. The weather has grounded Allied planes, blinded reconnaissance, and turned roads into graveyards of stalled vehicles. To most commanders, Bastogne is already lost, its fall just a matter of time measured in frostbitten minutes. Miles away, in a heated headquarters smelling of damp coats and exhaustion, a single decision is about to rip through that assumption like a shell through ice. General George S. Patton, Jr., stands over a map smeared with pencil lines and coffee stains, eyes burning with something that looks dangerously close to joy. Winter, distance, and German confidence have combined into the perfect trap, but Patton sees something else. He sees a stage. He sees an opening where others see a wall. In that moment, while Bastogne freezes and bleeds, Patton orders the impossible. A violent, full army pivot north through a blizzard, faster than any staff calculation says is sane. Tanks will turn on frozen roads. Men will march through nights that kill the careless. Time itself will be challenged. What almost no one hears, what history rarely captures, is the reaction in the highest Allied command when Patton makes his promise. In a quiet corner of headquarters, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower leans toward a trusted aide. His voice drops not for drama, but because disbelief has a way of whispering. He says something about Patton that will never appear in official communiques, something that reveals just how thin the line is between genius and madness when the stakes are this high. Those words only make sense once you understand what Patton is about to unleash on snow-choked roads and unsuspecting German columns. This story isn't just about speed or bravery. It's about preparation hidden behind arrogance, about plans rehearsed long before anyone knew they'd be needed. It's about German intelligence failures, Allied doubt, and the brutal arithmetic of winter warfare. In the next minutes, you'll hear untold details drawn from Patton's own diary, intercepted German messages, and the memories of soldiers who felt their engines freeze and their hope ignite at the same time. Before we dive deeper, subscribe if you want WWII stories told with tension, precision, and human truth, and comment below whether you think boldness wins wars or preparation does. Because as Bastogne waits for salvation, one general is about to test both against the coldest enemy of all: time. 48 hours earlier, the situation had looked nothing like a coming legend. It looked like collapse. On December 20, Allied headquarters buzzed with fragmented reports, broken units, and arrows on maps moving the wrong direction. Hitler's Ardennes offensive had achieved what German planners desperately needed: surprise. Radio silence, bad weather, and thin American lines allowed armored spearheads to punch west, sowing confusion deep behind the front. Bastogne wasn't chosen for symbolism. It was chosen because 7 critical roads met there. Lose the town and the German advance could flow like water. Hold it and the offensive would choke. From the German perspective, the math was simple. From the American one, it was terrifying. Inside 3rd Army headquarters, Patton studied the same chaos and reached a different conclusion. His army was oriented east, preparing to strike toward the Saar. Fuel, ammunition, and supply dumps were positioned accordingly. Turning north wasn't just a maneuver. It meant ripping an entire army out of its logistical spine in winter. Staff officers warned of ice-locked roads, immobilized armor, and exhausted infantry. One aide recalled Patton listening in silence, jaw clenched, then quietly asking for a calendar. He had anticipated this moment. Weeks earlier, Patton had forced his staff to rehearse contingency plans for a sudden German breakthrough in the Ardennes, earning eye rolls at the time. Now those improbable scenarios were being pulled from drawers, already annotated. German commanders, meanwhile, were operating on assumptions that felt increasingly safe. Intercepted messages reveal a confidence bordering on arrogance. Weather reports predicted continued cloud cover, no Allied air power. Intelligence summaries described American forces as disorganized, retreating, and incapable of rapid redeployment. One German staff note dismissed the possibility of a major counterstroke from the south as logistically impossible. Bastogne, they believed, would fall from isolation alone. The cold would do half the work. Eisenhower faced the crisis with the weight of the entire front on his shoulders. He needed certainty in a situation defined by fog, literal and metaphorical. When Patton arrived, impeccably confident as always, Ike tested him. "If I let you go, how soon can you attack north?" Patton didn't consult notes. He didn't ask for time. He answered instantly, 3 days. Then, seeing Eisenhower's expression, amended it. 2. The room went still. Staff officers froze, unsure whether they had just witnessed brilliance or recklessness. Eisenhower knew the risk, but he also knew Patton's reputation for delivering the unbelievable when properly unleashed. That night, as orders began to ripple through Third Army, chaplains received an unusual directive. Patton wanted a prayer specifically for clear weather, not victory, not safety, clear skies. To some, it sounded theatrical. To Patton, it was operational necessity. Air power would be the final piece of an otherwise impossible plan. As snow continued to fall and Bastogne's defenders braced for another night of encirclement, Third Army quietly began to move, while the enemy remained convinced it could not. The moment Patton's order went out, the war began to tick in smaller units of time. Not days, hours. At H hour, engines coughed to life in the dark, exhaust freezing into white plumes that hung over columns like ghosts. Tank crews beat ice from treads with rifle butts. Drivers navigated by memory because road signs were buried, and headlights risked drawing artillery. The pivot north unfolded like a controlled avalanche. At hour 6, the first bottlenecks formed. Refugee wagons frozen in place, half-tracks slid into ditches, bridges glazed with ice and fear. Engineers moved forward under sporadic fire, laying planks, spreading sand, praying the weight would hold. Every delay threatened the timetable Patton had promised without blinking. German units began to sense something was wrong before they understood it. Patrols reported American vehicles where no Americans were supposed to be. A captured German corporal would later say the shock wasn't the fighting, it was the direction. "They came from the snow," he testified, "from the south." Intercepted radio traffic shows mounting confusion. Reports contradicted each other, sightings dismissed as mistakes. German commanders believed the weather still protected them. That belief became their blindfold. Patton exploited it mercilessly, ordering aggressive reconnaissance, sudden thrusts, and noisy movements designed to exaggerate strength. He let rumors travel faster than armor, feeding the illusion of an American force that couldn't possibly be there, except that it was. Inside Bastogne, time felt heavier. The German surrender ultimatum arrived in crisp language that assumed inevitability. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe read it, stared for a moment, and delivered a one-word reply that masked exhaustion with defiance. "Nuts!" The message lifted spirits, but ammunition counts didn't lie. Artillery shells were rationed. Medics reused bandages. Wounded men listened for engines through the wind, unsure if hope was foolish. German artillery probed the perimeter, testing, waiting for collapse. None came. By hour 18, Third Army's lead elements were engaged. Snow muffled explosions, making battles feel intimate and sudden. Infantry advanced through woods so dense and white that orientation vanished. Compasses became lifelines. Tank commanders fired at muzzle flashes they could barely see. One after-action report describes the soundscape as engines screaming, metal ringing, men shouting names into the fog. Yet the momentum held. Patton's gamble was working because it denied the enemy time to react. German armor pivoted north too late, arriving piecemeal against a force already in motion. At Allied headquarters, reports began to defy expectations. Units were ahead of schedule. Resistance was lighter than feared. Eisenhower read the updates twice, then again. The impossible was becoming measurable. A staff officer recalled Ike turning away from the map, lowering his voice and speaking words meant only for the room, words that acknowledged Patton's audacity had crossed into something rarer. Not luck, not impulse, mastery under pressure. As night closed in on December 23, the distance between Third Army and Bastogne shrank to single digits. Snow still fell, but the clouds began to thin. For the first time since the encirclement began, the men in Bastogne heard a different sound above the wind, the distant, unmistakable growl of approaching armor. December 26, 1944, dawn broke with a pale, fragile light that felt like a promise no one dared say out loud. The clouds finally tore open, and with them came the roar of Allied aircraft, engines slicing the cold, parachutes blossoming white against blue as supplies rained down on Bastogne. Men cheered, some cried, some simply stared upward in disbelief. But relief from the sky was only half the story. On the ground, Patton's spearhead drove forward through villages shattered by shellfire, houses burning like torches against the snow. Every mile closer to Bastogne was paid for in frozen blood and broken steel. German units fought hard now, realizing too late what was happening, but they were reacting, not directing. Momentum had changed hands. Near the village of Eisenhower, the final barrier rose. German armor and anti-tank guns blocked the narrow road like a locked door. Patton's lead elements slammed into resistance at close range. Tanks fired point-blank, infantry advanced through waist-deep snow, grenades clutched tight, breath turning instantly to frost. One soldier later wrote that the cold stopped mattering. All you felt was the need to move forward. Orders crackled over radios, clipped and urgent. Patton, miles behind the line but mentally present at every choke point, demanded speed. Not caution. Speed was protection. Speed was survival. At approximately 4:50 p.m., a single American tank broke through the German line and rolled into Bastogne's perimeter. The moment wasn't announced with fanfare. There were no speeches, no flags raised. Just exhausted men staring at each other, disbelief slowly turning into laughter. The encirclement was broken. Bastogne was no longer alone. Soldiers embraced strangers. Medics worked without glancing at ammunition counts. For the first time in days, hope was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, steel-clad, and loud. Word traveled fast. Within hours, Eisenhower received confirmation that Patton's Third Army had done what weeks of planning said could not be done in days, let alone in winter. According to those present, Eisenhower paused longer than usual before responding. Then he repeated the words he had whispered earlier, now with certainty rather than astonishment. Privately, he acknowledged that Patton had not merely reacted to the German offensive. He had anticipated its shape and timing with unnerving accuracy. In public, Eisenhower was measured, professional. In private, he allowed himself admiration. German commanders faced the collapse of their timetable. Bastogne, meant to be a speed bump, had become a break. Fuel shortages worsened. Units that should have been racing west were now fighting to disengage. Hitler's gamble began to unravel, hour by hour, mile by mile. What had looked like an unstoppable surge dissolved into defensive withdrawals and desperate orders. For Patton, there was no victory speech. There was only the next order, the next push. But those who heard him that night remembered a quiet satisfaction, not triumph, but confirmation. Preparation had met opportunity in the worst conditions imaginable and prevailed. And in the frozen streets of Bastogne, men understood they had witnessed more than a rescue. They had seen time itself beaten. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge, but it changed its destiny. In the days that followed, Allied lines stabilized, then pressed forward, forcing the German offensive into a slow, grinding retreat it could no longer sustain. Historians would later note that Patton's maneuver didn't just save a town, it shattered the illusion of German initiative in the West. Hitler's last great gamble had depended on speed, surprise, and weather. Patton stole all three. German fuel dumps ran dry. Armored units that should have been driving for Antwerp were instead fighting to escape encirclement themselves. The blizzard that had promised German victory became the stage for their exhaustion. In post-war analyses, military scholars dissected Patton's decision with fascination. Some called it reckless, pointing to the razor-thin margins and the human cost. Others argued it was the purest example of operational art in modern warfare, preparation disguised as audacity. Patton had not improvised in desperation. He had rehearsed the unthinkable long before it was needed. His insistence on contingency planning, his obsession with speed, and his understanding of enemy psychology converged at Bastogne. Even critics conceded that few commanders possessed the nerve, or the trust in their troops, to execute such a maneuver under those conditions. Eisenhower rarely spoke publicly about his private reactions that December, but those close to him remembered the shift. Patton was no longer just the aggressive subordinate to be restrained. He was a weapon to be aimed carefully and decisively. The whispered words from headquarters became part of quiet lore among senior officers, a reminder that leadership sometimes means recognizing genius even when it arrives wrapped in ego and profanity. For Eisenhower, Bastogne reaffirmed a hard truth. Wars are won not only by plans, but by commanders willing to stake their reputations on moments that cannot wait. For the soldiers who marched and fought through that blizzard, the legacy was simpler. They remembered frozen hands, screaming engines, and the sudden, overwhelming relief of hearing friendly armor where none should have been. Many never forgot the feeling that speed had saved their lives, that hesitation would have killed them. In interviews decades later, veterans spoke less about Patton the man and more about Patton the force, the relentless pressure that kept them moving when stopping felt easier. Bastogne endures as more than a battlefield success. It is a lesson in preparation, decisiveness, and belief under impossible conditions. When time collapses and options vanish, leadership is revealed in the choices made without hesitation. In the winter of 1944, one general refused to accept the limits of weather, distance, and doubt, and thousands lived because of it. That is what Eisenhower understood in his whisper. And that is why, long after the snow melted, the road to Bastogne still points to something larger than war itself.